shall not have no other gods before me. And thou shalt not make any graven image, and thou shalt not take the name of the Lord God in vain. Remember the Sabbath day, oh Lord, and keep it holy.
Well, welcome to a special Friday night edition of Presbycast. Don't know if we've ever done a Friday night show before, but a few things happened today, and I think they're worth talking about. We are going to be joined by a special guest, Dr. Dominic Aquila, in just a moment. I think he's on the line, and we'll get to him shortly. But we're also joined by Amish Ambush of Twitter fame. We sort of consider him our show observer or ombudsman or advisor, and he's here too. We'd already planned to get together tonight. We're doing that, that uniquely Presbyterian thing of going to a long-distance funeral together tomorrow. So it's all worked out very nicely. But it is October the 22nd, 2021, which may prove to be an important day in the history of the PCA. And let's see if Dr. Aquila is with us. Are you there, sir?
Yes, sir. I am here.
Okay, good. Well, we've got you. And you're are you in some far-flung locale?
No, I'm in Florida.
Okay.
And I guess that might be far-flung, but yes, I'm here.
All right. Well, and we our friend Amish Ambush, are you with us there?
I'm here.
Yeah, he's actually in the room with me, but because of my huge monitor, we can't even see each other. But he's been with us before. So, Dr. Aquila, I assume that you've followed the news today, and I was thinking earlier, when was this complaint first filed?
It goes all the way back to about 2019. The real quick history is that Revoice was held July of 2018. That created a great deal of concern in the life of the church around the PCA. So both the Memorial Presbyterian Church session in St. Louis and also the Missouri Presbytery, of which Memorial is a part, and also the pastor of the church, teaching elder Greg Johnson, quite a few emails, letters, communications were sent to all three parties, the presbytery, the session, as well as directly to Greg Johnson. And so that led the presbytery then to set up a committee to study some of the concerns that were raised, or all the concerns, I guess, that were raised in these communications. Like I said, quite a few of them coming from presbyteries, individuals, and sessions. So that came in with a report in May of 2019, and there was a 141-page report. It's online if anyone needs to read it, in which they called it the Committee to Investigate Memorial Session, Greg Johnson, and Revoice. So they labeled it CIM because it was right. The first three words, Committee to Investigate Memorial, was first. So it's a CIM committee. They reported, and in that report there were 9 recommendations, and those recommendations, after the committee had given its report, were then acted on one after another, and they were all approved. One of the teaching elders, Ryan Speck, S-P-E-C-K, believed that the actions of those particular, the formulation of those recommendations were, he felt, out of sorts with the confession and our Reformed theology. And so he filed a complaint alleging where these recommendations that had been approved, he believed, were out of phase. So basically the complaint alleged that Presbytery erred by adopting recommendations that were contrary to the Constitution of the PCA, part of which, of course, includes the Confession and the Catechisms. That was heard by the Presbytery in July of 2019, in which the Presbytery at that point went ahead and said, okay, we will accept the fact that we didn't do this right. And so they basically sustained the complaint. But they also did it with this proviso that they will revisit those recommendations again, and they did in December of 2019. So from July, after they sustained it, they brought them up again. They cut out a couple of them at this point, and basically they re-voted and reaffirmed or adopted all the present ones. I think there were 6 of them by this point. A couple of them were not that relevant, and the one was put to a study committee. And so then he refiled his complaint. Actually, it was a new complaint because it was a different set of recommendations that were adopted. And then when the Presbytery did deal with it, it was because, by that point, this is now end of 19, and we know what happened within the first quarter of 20 that COVID hit. So it was a while before they actually got to the complaint to adjudicate it, because they just, we couldn't meet. The Presbytery wasn't able to meet. And so they finally met. They denied the complaint. And so he filed that with the SJC. Now that became what in the parlance became case 2020-05. So that was really
that's the Standing Judicial Commission.
Right.
They are a commission, so their word is typically final, and this keeps the PCA from having to try the highest level judicial cases in the assembly of 2,000 people.
Exactly, and that's, by the way, what was being done before. It was actually broken up into committees at General Assembly, and so that made it difficult because you then got all sorts of different types of opinions, because it would have to be made up on the fly. You didn't have time to study it and look up precedents and that kind of thing. So the SJC was actually established and begun operating in 1989. So from 1973 to 1988, all the judicial cases were handled at General Assembly themselves. And so that complaint was filed. Meanwhile, if you back up a little bit, because of what had happened with Revoice, 3 of our presbyteries in the PCA acted on what is called the Book of Church Order, Chapter 34, and it's paragraph 1. So it's BCO 34-1, which says that if at least 2 presbyteries request the General Assembly to assume original jurisdiction over a person, a member, which of course in this case would be someone in presbytery, so would have to be a minister. Then if 2 of them request it, then the General Assembly shall consider and take the matter up. And there's a little squib there that says if the presbytery has refused to act, and so that's been one of the definitional interpretive discussions as to what that really means in the whole span of things. But when there were 3 presbyteries that did it, so that was obviously more than 2. They were immediately forwarded when they came into the State Clerk's office of the PCA General Assembly, forwarded to the SJC, the Standing Judicial Commission, and they began to look at seeing how they would process that. And because if they assumed original jurisdiction, that means they would then deal with whatever charges, if there were charges or allegations, or maybe conducting an investigation. So technically, the way things happen on a normal channel is if you are a communicant member of a local church, and there's some issue or some question about your character, your actions, then the matter is brought to the session of your church. If you're a minister who's a member of presbytery and there's something that happens that's questionable, allegations raised, then it's adjudicated by the presbytery. So each has their own court of jurisdiction. So in this case, then, if either so if a minister then is found not the presbytery is not dealing with it, something that some two other presbyteries believe they should have, at least two, then they can ask the General Assembly to assume original jurisdiction. So that was passed by 3, and it was sent to the Standing Judicial Commission. Meanwhile, when that came up, Missouri Presbytery, they said, well, we really haven't done an investigation of Teaching Elder Johnson specifically with these allegations that he was part of that study committee review where the memorial session, Dr. Johnson and Revoice were looked at. So they went back and did what would be in our parlance called the BCO 31-2 investigation. That's BCO Chapter 31.
Yes, and for our live viewers, I've had that on the screen, and I have it on the screen again.
Okay, so 31-2 is just calls for if somebody raises a question about your report, your character, then the session and or the presbyter can demand satisfactory explanation, and they can even go to doing an investigation if they believe that it's warranted. And if that investigation raises a strong presumption of guilt, then excuse me, the court shall move to process, and that means institute process, and that means that they will file formal charges. Or they will say, we don't find that the investigation raised a strong presumption of guilt, and they basically dismiss the matter. And that's it, it's over. Well, Presbytery did the investigation, and they concluded the latter, which was that we don't find the issues strong enough that raise a strong presumption of guilt so that it would warrant us proceeding to judicial process and filing charges and conducting a trial. And when that happened, then Teaching Elder Speck then filed a complaint against that, saying that Presbytery didn't do its due diligence in the filing, in the investigation, and then looking at how the questions were answered by Teaching Elder Johnson. So that is the case that we're talking about now. And that
so essentially the Presbytery took Johnson at his word and said that his answers are sufficient. And
that's right.
The complainant, T.E. Speck, he didn't agree with that, and it's his right as a member of the court to protest the action of the court.
Exactly. And so the way it was framed was, did Missouri Presbytery err by failing to find a strong presumption of guilt against Teaching Elder Johnson? And so the complaint had to demonstrate that here are the areas that they examined him on. Here's what they investigated. Here's how he answered. And we believe the complaint alleged that the presbytery should have seen that this is how he said this formulation, how he spoke on this view, and so forth, were not consistent with the confession, and that's what the complaint was arguing. So that was filed in 2020,
and that superseded, that put on hold the overtures that were asking the SJC to take up the matter on their own.
Well, what it did is the SJC put them on saying, okay, they were about to move forward to determine whether or not there was enough evidence or enough grist for the mill for the General Assembly to assume original jurisdiction. So before they actually made that decision, then here came the complaint alleging that Presbytery had erred in not finding a strong presumption of guilt. So that became the case 2020-12. And so that one was filed. That's the second complaint. The first one dealt with purely with the structural, the Presbytery adopting recommendations from the study committee that were in their report. That was May of 19, July of 19. They sustained, but by December of 19, they reaffirmed 6 of those recommendations. That became 2002-05. That one has not been adjudicated yet. We have had the hearing on it, but there has been no proposed decision rendered. It's coming close because there is a window period of time by which after the hearing, the panel of the Standing Judicial Commission has to produce their proposed decision. Then the second one came, and so when that second one came to the SJC, you did what you just said. Is they said, let's put on hold, on the back burner, these requests from these three presbyteries to assume original jurisdiction, and let's take up that case, because it really is going to probably help us to make the assessment as to whether or not we should assume jurisdiction or not. And so we went through the normal process. Now, normally, what happens is when a case comes in, it's found to be in order. First, the officers get it, they review it to make sure it's filed correctly, and the person who files it's a member, and so forth. So that was found in order. Normally, then it is assigned to a panel. And a panel, there are 24 members of the Standing Judicial Commission, 12 ruling elders, 12 teaching elders. And so it's assigned to a three-man panel with two alternates. And they then handle the case and then go take it all the way through a hearing, and then draft a proposed recommended decision that the whole SJC still has to review, and they do it very carefully, line by line, and so forth. In this instance, because of the importance of the case had come, because of the way it's come to the General Assembly and its height of interest within the church and the issues that were being raised by it, the SJC decided that they do something they haven't done for a long time, is conduct a hearing with all members present in one place and in person. With COVID, they had not been meeting in person, they'd been using media, as many of us have in our various meetings, whether it's worship or session meetings and presbytery meetings and the like. So we met in Atlanta March 25, and there was a hearing. That means each side, the complainant side and the respondent for presbytery side, you write a brief, and there's certain rules about how long the brief is and how it's to be argued. And then in the hearing, you have each side has 30 minutes of clock time. And the reason I say clock time is because if a question is asked during the time that you're making your presentation, the clock stops, and the members are asking questions. Only the SJC members can ask questions. We can't crosstalk to one another. And so it sometimes, to get through 30 minutes, may take an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, depending on the case. Well, in this instance, it lasted 6.5 hours. So we started at 9 o'clock in the morning and meeting in Atlanta with everyone present in one room, and two sentences, bang, there were questions. And you say another 3 sentences after you answer that, questions. So we'd go on like that for both sides.
Now,
and
you know this because you were there. You were assisting the complainant.
I was speaking of providing representation for him.
This all sounds very complicated, and I have on the screen to give you everyone a feeling of the size of the task that the SJC had. The report from Missouri Presbytery was 125 pages all by itself, and it was so complex that they had about 7 colors of text. So I'm on page 5 or 6, and they actually tell you how to read the report, and it's incredibly complicated. So,
yep.
But the Presbyterian justice, one of the reasons the wheels roll slowly is because everything about it is complex. And as we'll probably discuss later, what the higher courts typically look at more than the truth or falsity, although they do look at the truth or falsity of information, they're primarily and first concerned with process. But I think anyone who looks at these documents can get a feel for how daunting the task was. And hearing you describe it is, it's complicated. So everyone should bear that in mind.
Yes, it is. It's not just going in and tweaking it. So, and whatever you write in the brief has to be based on the record of the case. So as you said, the record of the case was voluminous. It was over 600 some pages, and so so you have to know where things are and what pages. Normally you write that in the brief. So as you're making your point, you say it's record of the case, page so and so says. You refer to it, so that because the SJC is charged with the responsibility of hearing the matter and making their judgment based on the record of the case, not with reference to persons and so forth and so on. That's the ideal. Probably isn't always doesn't always work that way, because we all bring our biases. But then there are 24 people. Actually, there were 23. One member was absent because of medical issues. So so we went. It was intense, and the questions are, both sides get grilled deeply. So you have to be prepared to take the grilling, and so you have to know your subject matter and where the record of the case is, and your theology and so forth, because we were dealing with the confession, catechism, the history of of those things as well, and that's so it's important, and so you could, and all the members of the committee are polled, of the SJC are polled at the very beginning, that they have read the record of the case. So they're not allowed to come in and try and make up real quickly as they're sitting there and read it. They have to have done their homework ahead of time, and so that's an important criteria. So now that was March, and then normally the way there's a manual that guides the Standing Judicial Commission. It's called the Operating Manual, OM-SJC, Operating Manual of the Standing Judicial Commission. And it's very involved, very specific about how people who come before them are to act, and how they're to write briefs, also how the members are to act, and how the kind of questions they ask, and what they're charged with regard to how they're to prepare for any case they're going to hear. So normally you would have 40 days after the hearing to have a draft of a proposed decision. But just as we were getting close, as they were getting close to it, I should say, some questions were asked that the SJC decided that it would ask and they were directed to the presbytery. We want clarification on certain things. So these questions were drafted. I think there were about 5-6 pages of questions that were sent, and they had a certain number of time, I think 3 weeks, to respond to that. Then they would be sent in. The complainant had 5 or 6 days to read and to respond if he wanted to. So we looked at it carefully, and we did send in. It was limited to 5 pages to add to the brief we'd already submitted for the hearing, which is 10 pages. And then after that, the respondent would also have opportunity to submit up to a 5-page response to the questions that were answered, and whatever response that the complainant gave. And then they would go back and to look. Now, at that point, we were hoping that a committee, that they would have been a decision, and that it would probably, given the way we left, meaning the sense that we had is there was a divided Standing Judicial Commission, and what we were hoping for is that there would be at least a majority proposed decision and a minority proposed decision on one side or the other. And the minority proposed decision is defined as at least 1/3 of the members voting agreeing that they're a minority. And so you need a certain number before you consider the minority in the definition of the Book of Church Order. And then if that happened, it would have then been automatically put on the floor of the next General Assembly, which at that point would have been here in 2021. But to do that required that it be in the hands of each clerk of session each church, each session, 30 days before the call to order at General Assembly. General Assembly was going to be called to order on June 29. All that paperwork of asking and answering those questions took us right up to about May 24th. So there was no way that they were going to be able to put together a proposed decision and then have a majority minority such that they could come to the floor of General Assembly in 21.
So that's why there was nothing to vote on specifically regarding Greg Johnson at the last General Assembly.
Exactly. That was the reason.
But neither will there, because of today's decision, neither will there be anything for the General Assembly to vote on in regards to these cases at the next General Assembly, next June or July.
Right now, just the 2020-12, the one that was just finalized, that was released today, because the vote was 16-7, and you needed 8. Given if you 1/3 of 23 voting is 8, and so one short, and so that doesn't go to General Assembly. And the rule in both our Book of Church Order and the manual of the Standing Judicial Commission is that because it is a commission of the General Assembly, if there isn't this minority majority vote that goes to the court, then the SJC's vote concludes the matter. So the matter is over. It's been voted on.
So people are going to ask, what next?
Okay, well, what next would be the second complaint now that still has to be adjudicated. Given the vote here, and given that we're dealing with almost substantially about the same thing, because it's dealing with definition of terms from the Confession and Catechism, in terms of what those recommendations that were approved in May of 2019. We might think that the vote may be about the same. It could be that it's going to be different. I don't know. We had the hearing almost 40 days ago, because in fact on May 24th will be the 40th day. So the panel has to have something to the stated clerk of General Assembly, as a proposed decision that then the parties have time to review, and if they want to submit a supplemental brief in response to that proposed decision.
Okay. Well, clarify again the nature of the outstanding complaint that is not there. There is yet another complaint involving Missouri Presbyterian Greg Johnson. Tell us about that. I mean, you're saying it'll probably be decided the same way, but that's not a foregone conclusion.
Well, the second one deals mainly with the presbyteries approving those recommendations, so they're not directly related to teaching Elder Johnson.
Okay,
they're directed to just conceptually this committee, because they studied the critique or the criticism that was coming from the church at large, all the volume of emails and letters and phone calls and whatnot that they received, was saying, we are disturbed that Missouri Presbytery is allowing a ministry like Revoice, or work like Revoice, to be in the presbytery, to meet in one of those churches, and if it's churches, and nothing was done until we sort of put this outside pressure.
Right. So the first Revoice conference was hosted by Greg Johnson's church. Right. The two since, I think last year was just online. They moved to sort of a hotel venue in 19. They didn't meet live in 20. This year they met at a mega church in Dallas. Right,
exactly. So so they, at least they got the message that let's not keep it within a PCA church. That even though it was not sponsored, they made a distinction by, we didn't sponsor it, they just used our facilities. But the rule of thumb is that you don't let your facilities be used for any and all purposes. You have to, it's the responsibility of the session to take watch care over its reputation, and not making sure that it's not used for things that are out of accord with our confession and the character that we believe is important. So that was why the criticism came for the session that they allowed their building to be used for something that is highly questionable.
So much of this has been about language and definitions and terms. I mean, there are things that Johnson said one way and then he said them another, and there are ways he's changed his terminology and definition since then. Some of it's pretty, I don't want to say it's arbitrary, but it's like there's a different glossary in this side B gay Christianity movement that doesn't exactly line up with, certain dictionary or, theological text definitions. And that's a lot of the rub here, right?
Oh, absolutely. And it's very slippery. This is just personally, I read the confession, and while some of the language is quite highfalutin and you have to understand the technicalities and so forth from it, but I walk away and I say, I understand what it says. It defines sin as sin, defines emotions towards sin as sin, desires as sin. There are certain definitions that are unique to Reformed theology.
Yeah, and there are understandings that are shared about not agreeing with the Roman Catholic doctrine of concupiscence, for instance.
Right. And what that means is, since you've just used a big word here that we don't use in our everyday language or discussion, concupiscence basically is the idea that that if you have a desire, if you see something, in the Roman Catholic view, is if you see something and that is a temptation and you desire it, and you're really thinking on it, mulling over whether or not you participate, they say, if you do not exercise your will to do it, then it's not sin because you have not acted on the will. The Reformed view, and that's in the confession, is you have that desire. Even the desire for something, even if you don't act on it, is also sin, is sin as well. And that's where the slippery slope, if you would, or the slippery language comes along. Well, you just desire it, and sometimes you say you desire, but I'm not acting on it. But I really wrestle with it, but it's not sin, And so when the question is asked, is homosexuality sin or same-sex attraction a sin? Then you get an answer like, well, it's of sin, and you say, what does that mean? And then you try and get your mind around a statement like that, and you start going down all sorts of rabbit trails trying to make sense of it. You read the confession and it doesn't do that. It's very clear in terms of that any desire for sin and emotions towards that is sin, and we need to deal with that as sin on its face, and not make this matter of whether or not your will has acted on it or not. And that's what concupiscence says. You don't. If you haven't acted on it, then there's no sin. Therefore, you're not guilty.
All right. I think another teaching elder has joined us, and let me see if he can hear us. I don't want to keep him too long because he's busy. Jared, are you with us?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, it's Jared Nelson. He's a teaching elder in the PCA. I think he's up somewhere near Pittsburgh, somewhere up there. And Jared, what you've heard about Dr. Quill has said, giving us a rundown. The content of the decision. What would you say to help clarify or explain or anything you want to add to this?
Yeah, something that I find interesting in reading through the language of the decision is just the layout of the allegation, what is alleged that the teaching elder said, and then their conclusion based on that. And on the first three allegations, it says, if the record demonstrated that the above statements were an accurate summary of the TE's views, it would have been proper to sustain the complaint. So the way that I read this is the allegations, they would take as serious and as something that were chargeable which I think is interesting. If you look through the allegations, you have an allegation that the teaching elder denies that same-sex attraction is sinful and thereby fails to properly distinguish misery from the sin which gives rise to it. It seems that they're saying, if you say that is wrong and wrong enough that it's a chargeable offense, but that they didn't find that it was proven. And probably some of that was due to the lengthy responses that they get from the teaching elder of their views. Second allegation, if the TE compromises and dishonors his identity in Christ by self-identifying as a same-sex attracted man, I think this is the self-appellation of gay, that if that was proven, and it's the same language there, it would have been proper to sustain the complaint. So I'm an eternal optimist in that, in trying to have an optimistic reading of this, it seems that the Standing Judicial Commission is not saying that it's okay to do these things, but that it was saying that it didn't feel that it was proved that the teaching elder here did and say these things. And even though it's not sustaining it, and we can debate whether or not that's true, I have my own opinions on that. That is at least one note of optimism is, just the difficulty on proving a case individually doesn't necessarily reflect on if that doctrine is being really denied or dismissed by the Standing Judicial Commission. I didn't know if you guys had any thoughts on just the language of that almost not proven.
Yeah, well, here, that's a very important point, because what we're dealing with here was not a case. This was an investigation. The investigation was only to raise a strong presumption of guilt. In other words, where there is a standard by which you go and you say that we find that these issues are wrong, that these definitions are questionable, that the formulations that they put together are questionable, and are such that it does raise a suspicion or a reasonable level of guilt that needs to be processed through the course of a trial. So what the SJC did was to basically treat it almost as if he had already been on trial, and that the allegations of the charges, which really were still allegations at the point, were not proven. Well, they never got to the court case to be proven. It was the investigation only raises a strong enough presumption that needs to go further, and that's why you have a trial.
So the decision was not an exoneration of Greg Johnson. It was an exoneration of Missouri Presbytery's investigation.
Right. Did they do sufficient investigation? That was the question. And by the way they raised the question, they're saying if the record had shown this and shown that, then it would be proven. That is a standard for what you do when you're saying, did they prove beyond a reasonable doubt or preponderance of the evidence that this was true? That's not the standard. That's for once the case has been done and he should be found guilty, then he files an appeal. And then the question is, was the evidence that that was raised against him, in which he was found guilty, were the standards such that it proved that he was guilty? And then you can raise the questions here that the record didn't show this and the record didn't show that. What the record does show is that there was evidence of a strong presumption. And that's all the standard needed to be done in order to bind it over for trial, that is, or to use the 31-2 language, institute process. In other words, there are no charges until there's a finding of a strong presumption and the presbytery then votes to institute process. Then you have the charges, because then you appoint a prosecutor and they draft an indictment and then conduct a trial.
Well, the reason for the calls for investigation are some of the things that Greg Johnson has said in the past. And I think in some ways it depends on whether you look at his earlier statements or his later statements, or whether you read them all in the very best light, or whether you apply, I don't know, a certain common sense judgment to them. Jared, I know you've had some opinions on, whether you know, which part should be taken? How, which statement should receive the most weight? And you told me that you think that part of this is has Greg Johnson called himself a gay Christian? He says no. Missouri Presbytery says no, but there is a printed record that would lead a reasonable person to maybe think that's not the case.
Well, I think some of the difficulty there is, are you looking for what some would call shibboleth, right? Have you put those two particular words together and have them touching of gay Christian? Because in certain contexts, Greg has referred to himself as gay. He says that in the documents that are before the SJC, but he hasn't put gay and Christian together as if it was a modifier to that, and that's his statement there. I guess some of the question is, should you apply that appellation to yourself in any sort of context? And there almost seems to be of two minds if you actually read the reports, between the RPCNA report that says that's not biblical language and we should stick with biblical language. Even the language of homosexual and orientation only came out in the 1800s with psychoanalysis and Freud. Or the AIC that says it's not wise, though some people could mean it in a certain context to mean something, but that it should be avoided. So the RPCNA report's a lot stronger on that than the AIC. So it seems like
tell them what the AIC is. Tell them what the AIC is.
The ad interim committee report. That's the PCA's sexuality report.
Now, it's not particularly long or complicated. We're teaching through that in my church on Wednesday nights. A lot of churches have done that. It's a pretty good report. I think it has some weaknesses, but it's much simpler to understand than many of the documents, I think, in this case. It can be helpful, but it has no binding quality either. I think people lean on that, but it's not the law of the church. It's a snapshot of the understanding of the church. But everyone should look at that. But it has certainly affected this process, and it's been used throughout, or since it's been in existence, because it wasn't in existence at the very beginning of this, but it was prompted by the Revoice controversy, no doubt.
One thing I thought may be interesting to hear Dominic's opinion on, since he was involved with some of the FV cases 10 or so or more years ago,
meaning Federal Vision.
To me, a lot of this seems very similar. The Federal Vision cases, and to me, it seems like a lot of this feels similar to how Federal Vision controversy played out in the PCA, in that you had the controversy come up and a few figures that were connected to it, Peter Leithart, Jeff Myers, and then you had a call for a study report that was widely accepted. But then individual cases, you just find it's very hard to prove doctrinal error in individual cases, and neither Leithart nor Jeff Myers were found guilty on that, and kind of on the same grounds of it wasn't proven. But I wonder if either of you see this playing out similarly, for good or for ill, in that you may not get individual cases, but Federal Vision 10 years later is not a huge force within the PCA. Presbyterians know to ask questions about it, wondering if this might play out in a similar sort of fashion.
Well, I think another similarity is the incredible volume, truckloads of nuance, and some very complicated terminology and very different understandings of some of the material. That's certainly a similarity. But Dr. Quilla, what Jared's question is, what similarities are between this and the number of Federal Vision cases from the early 2000s?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I did see similarities, because I was serving on the Standing Judicial Commission during all those periods of time, and it was interesting that I saw a shift take place where we had two major cases, one coming out of what was then Louisiana Presbytery, which doesn't exist any longer, partly because it fell apart under the weight of all the conflict that rose through federal vision that was so prominent in quite a few churches in that presbytery at the time, and also the one out of Pacific Northwest Presbytery. That in both of those instances, in the case of Louisiana Presbytery, it was still in the allegation area that was raised. And so because there had been a complaint that had been filed that alleged the same thing as this case, that Presbytery did not do its due diligence in the means by which they inquired, just like the present case that we're talking about. Did the Presbytery do its due diligence in the way it inquired about it to be able to develop a strong presumption of guilt or not? And so it's interesting that at that point, the Stang Judicial Commission found that the Presbytery did err and did not ask the perceptive questions. We had the transcript and we went through it carefully. We looked at it and it wasn't there. But in the process of doing it, there were a lot of what we would consider what was considered to be, language that was not straightforward or was nuanced and things like that. So the SJC decided that in that case, that was around 2007, to say to the Presbytery, yes, there is sufficient evidence here to bind over for trial. There is strong evidence of a strong presumption of guilt, and you need to move forward on that. So it was remanded to the Presbytery to conduct the case, given some guidelines. And the same thing happened with the Pacific Northwest case with Lightheart. And there was a complaint that came, that there was a presentation that Lightheart presented his views on the report, the Federal Vision Study Committee report. At the end, there was a place that said, if you feel like if your position is, your views rather, are appear to be contrary to what is stated here, and they outlined what those statements were, then you should inform your Presbytery under vow number 2, which says that if any of your views change to the assumption, your ordination vow, you should on your own accord make your changes known to your Presbytery. And what they do is evaluate whether or not what your changes are allowable or not allowable. So he sent in his views. The Presbytery evaluated them and said, no, there's no big issue here. Everything's fine. And there was a complaint to say, no, Presbytery, the way he formulated this and this and this are questionable. The Presbytery denied the complaint. It was brought to the Stang Judicial Commission. It evaluated it. We had a hearing on it and agreed with the complainant that the issues were not really answered, and there was a strong presumption, and they remanded that to Presbytery to conduct a trial and giving guidance in the written report. So you can look that up. That was about 2009, and so they did conduct a trial based on the Stang Judicial Commission finding there was a strong presumption. Presbytery erred at that point. Well, almost the same. It's almost exactly the same thing here, that the evidence that has been presented in the case by the complainant and the questions were at the same level of allegations of questionable formulations that we had in those two other cases. Exactly the same. But what I see in the response in the committee, the judicial rendering, the decision, is that they were using the standard that he had been put on trial, defended himself, Presbytery didn't accept that, and therefore found him guilty. And then he, could file an appeal, as I said before, and argue that the Presbytery didn't make its case at that level. That's a totally different marker and standard than if you're looking for a strong presumption of guilt. And so, yes, I see a clear things. Now, by the time we got another case that came a few years later from out of Sulin's Presbytery, began to see a shift take place where the Stang Judicial Commission was starting to lower its threshold for and began making decisions comparable to what they did with this case, this complaint, 2020-12, and Missouri Presbyterian Greg Johnson. I really think they've shifted their opinion, and it's unfortunate because I think it leaves the church vulnerable to accepting. We have basically what's happened is through judicial process, the PCA has now officially become a Side B church. It was the very reason what we were fighting against with these overtures that were passed and that we're voting on as the presbyteries. Should we do these things where we're trying to give clarity of qualifications for office that deal not only with what does it mean to be above reproach, not only in the human sexuality area, but in every area. You know, whether it deals with the Eighth Commandment and embezzlement, whether it deals with the Ninth Commandment that you're a prevaricator, or whether it deals with Ten Commandment that you're not satisfied and so you're a grouse, or the Seventh Commandment you're acting immorally. So we want the standard to be set, and now presbytery or the General Assembly could have assumed original jurisdiction. We'll never know because we haven't put it to the test of a trial.
Right.
That's
so
where
we're not likely to have a resolution anytime soon because of this decision. It's not going to go to the full General Assembly. It stops here. The buck stops here for the moment. So let me make a quick observation. If you looked at the Federal Vision era and you read all that stuff and you tried to follow it and understand it, you probably thought at that time nothing could be more complicated and contentious, and so many people could look at it from so many different angles and see completely different things than the Federal Vision controversy. But we found something just as complicated, just as hard to parse, and just as various in its perception, and that's the gay Christian, same-sex attracted officer desire, the whole thing, the whole ball of wax here. So we found something that's not the Federal Vision, but that is similarly complicated. So everyone should keep that in mind. But we do need to answer the question: does this mean? I'm asking Jared and Dr. Aquila. Does this mean that the PCA is now a Side B denomination, or that have we opened the door, welcomed and affirmed gay Christian ministers or same-sex attracted ministers on the order of Greg Johnson? Jared, that's an easy one. You can jump in first.
I don't think that this decision means that we are a Side B denomination any more than we are a Federal Vision denomination, because there were individual cases that did not result in a guilty verdict. And I especially think the language here, I'm an eternal optimist about things. And if you look at the language here, it is not saying that it's okay to say these things or do these things. It just seems like the decision was they're at least saying that it wasn't proven from the record of the case. Now, we might disagree with that, but still, it is not saying it's okay to say that you do not pursue orientation change. That was allegation 3. It's not saying it's okay for you to say that you don't have to pursue that. It's not saying that it's okay for you to have self-identifying language. It's saying that wasn't proven in this particular case. And maybe this is kind of a warning for us not to try to have the SJC be the one to bail us out of certain doctrinal matters, when this may be something that we need to keep an eye on in our presbyteries. Are we asking the right questions when candidates come up? Are we?
Well, that's exactly what the overtures were about.
Mm-hmm.
But I might as well throw in the idea that it's not altogether certain that overtures 23 and 37 are going to pass the requisite number of presbyteries. In fact, I don't think they will. They could. How this will affect all that, I can't say. But so I'll ask you, Jared, and then Dr. Aquila can jump in. Would the combined effect of this decision and the non-approval by 2/3 plus one presbyteries of overtures 23 and 37, which touch on all these issues, is that going to give it's going to give at least the impression in a lot of people's minds that we are, if not fully affirming of side B, much friendlier to it than maybe we ought to be?
Oh, I'm certain the impression will be there. I think it'll depend, because we've always been a grassroots denomination, for what it's worth, on what your local presbytery decides can come in and come out. You see that with creation issues of there's some presbyteries, some things don't fly and others that does. So I think it reveals a bit that we are, in some ways, a coalition of presbyteries, and there's not a uniform prescription if those overtures fail, and if there's not something that replaces them, there could always be efforts to have a slightly tweaked version or something like that. So I don't think this question is over because of this decision, but I do think the perception could be there, and people could misread it. As I think if you look on Twitter, there's a lot of people that are misreading this decision in some ways too.
Yeah, Dr. Aquila, what do you think the combined effect of all this is?
Yeah, I'm an eternal optimist as well, but I'm sorry, I don't agree with the description that's given here. The church had an opportunity to do like we did with the other cases in the past, to allow this to go to trial because there was sufficient evidence to raise a strong presumption, and it basically treated it as if he had already been on trial, and that isn't the case, and that's where it should have been handled. And there was, sometimes these cases can be, judged, it was supposed to judge without regard to persons, but, the human beings are human beings, and we don't walk into the room blindfolded and just listen to the facts and the record of the case. But I really do believe judicially that we are officially now a side B, because I think there's sufficient evidence to the fact, they said it was not in the record. There are other accounts that do point to the fact that there's an accepting of same-sex attractiveness, and that issue that I think is going to come back and haunt us.
Let me read you what Greg Johnson wrote on Twitter today about 5 o'clock. After a 3-year ordeal through church courts, the PCA's Supreme Court has ruled in favor of me and my presbytery. This ruling is final. So he takes it as a vindication, a personal vindication, and exoneration. But as we've said to this point, there's another case still. The case didn't really rule on Johnson per se, but more the process and the trial. But many people are taking victory laps on this, but you're saying those may be premature, even though you think this is an unwise step, that it's going to give the impression that we're a side B friendly denomination.
Right. The question that was here was in what was before the presbytery, and this is where the complaint came, because the complaint is against the action of a court. The court had taken an action to not find a strong presumption of guilt. The complainant alleged they should have found a strong presumption. Here are the reasons why. Here are the things that were said that were left off and not dealt with or not confronted, not really got a clarity answer. And so if they had been found, if the SJC had ruled in favor of the complaint, it sustained it, then it could have been remanded or to the presbytery to conduct a trial, or the SJC itself could conduct it to determine whether or not that sense of a strong presumption could be tested in the context of all the rules of evidence that are required in our Book of Church Order. And that's what's important. Okay. And so it is not, so the issue isn't resolved. So it ruled Johnson wasn't the one on trial per se. In fact, it wasn't a trial. It was looking at the evidence that was presented in such a way that whether or not it showed a strong presumption. The complainant argued that if you look at it carefully, yes, it does show strong presumption. It should have gone to trial, and the presbytery failed in that. That's where the dispute is, because it's going to be interpreted as, because who's going to now fight against something like that again? So now we have, in fact, adopted by a backdoor approach, a side B, a definition of things, because the only thing we have is you put all of these things in that record of the case, and you're saying, well, the record doesn't really show this and the record doesn't show that, but all the time the only reason it's in the record is because it was raised, it was discussed, someone was holding to it.
All right.
So there was,
go ahead.
So there was no exoneration.
Right. So got a friend with me here he's actually an ordained deacon. He hasn't served for a few years, but he's sort of the voice of the common man. He's in the house with me tonight. Amish, how do you perceive this? I mean, those of us who are sort of in the process, we can get lost in the minutia and the process. That's one of the things. There are people who like to go to Presbyterian meetings just because it's like this, it's a club, and you got all these cool things, and people who know more about the process have status, and you can get lost in the machine rather than the output sometimes. But I want to ask my friend Amish. I'll ask him if he has any questions of either of you. But first, I want to say, how do you read this? When you viewing it from the outside, viewing it from social media and the internet, and what you hear, how do you view it?
So, Overtures 23 and 37, they received overwhelming support at GA. These are sent to the presbytery in order to amend the BCO. 2/3 of the denomination's presbyteries, they need to vote in favor of this, right? And then it's sent to GA. With this decision today and the way that the votes have been going in the presbyteries, it seems unlikely that those overtures are going to pass. I just want to know, what do you perceive the fallout from this being? It's bizarre to me that we could be so galvanized at GA as conservatives, and it doesn't translate to the presbytery level. So what is the fallout? Do conservatives have the stomach to take back committees, that long process? If this is a last straw for conservative churches in the PCA, and they start looking at ARP, OPC, forming a new denomination, does even taking back the reins in the PCA, is that even feasible at this point? So several questions here, but that's my observation.
Yeah, so your question is what's next? I mean, because people who are members of PCA churches and officers who aren't particularly plugged in, they hear about these things and they say, can my church stay in the PCA, and what's going to happen to the PCA? So that's the question. Jared, you want to take a stab at that?
Well, I hope that it's an impetus for more elders to be involved and go to presbytery. I was talking to an elder recently, teaching elder that was decrying some of the things that were going on, but hasn't been to his past 2 presbytery meetings with no real excuse for it. And I would hope that would be something that would people would start doing and pay attention. Nominate somebody that you think is good for a permanent committee, and pay attention to people that are coming through your presbytery. I think that's really where it has to start, is asking good questions there and being involved in your presbytery. I think a lot of, maybe one good thing that can come from this too is I think a lot of people have been asleep at the wheel and thought presbytery wasn't all that important, and realized, well, presbytery is important because we vote on overtures, and that goes up to GA level, and that affects the entire denomination.
Well, let me ask a question. We had pretty good ruling elder participation at this last GA, and because of the BCO, there are actually more ruling elders required on committees than you typically see, in the general population of the GA. But it's my perception that if even GA is dominated by pastors, teaching elders, and borders on clericalism, but many presbyteries are even more dominated by teaching elders. It's more of it's a pastors' club that meets on a weekday, and it's really the machinations of a presbytery are almost as impenetrable to an occasional participant as General Assembly. So is the disconnect between the heavy support for the overtures at General Assembly and the struggle to get a similar percentage of presbyteries to approve them? Might it be because presbyteries are actually dominated by pastors?
Well, and also math. It's not as if you have to get 50% of presbyteries. You have to get 2/3. And
I was told there would be no math, to quote the great Chevy Chase.
But you have to not only get a majority of presbyteries to support a BCO amendment, but 2/3 and a majority in those 2/3 where, you see, many will see the numbers if you have friends that are in different presbyteries of things failing by 3 votes. And so you have, you may have at the end of this even 2/3 of elders that show up at presbytery meetings voting for it, but you have one presbytery that's unanimous and the other one where it fails by 3 votes. So some of that is the strangeness of geography and math and how it's a bit different at the presbytery level than it is GA, and that it has to be 2/3.
Yeah, and the representation is more along the Senate model, because my presbytery had 99 voters this week on the overtures. There are some presbyteries that will have 20 votes, and there'll be 18 pastors and 2 ruling elders, but they have the same weight in the mathematical calculation. So it is what it is from that perspective. Dr. Quilla, what do you think about, is there a disconnect between the last GA's action? Maybe people just thought about what they did and have been convinced by the excellent arguments from the other side, and people who voted for the overtures at General Assembly are now voting against them. What do you think?
I'm not sure if there are vote changes that are taking place. I think the folks that normally don't come, or churches that don't normally have ruling elders that come, can bring, say we need to deal with it here. We didn't bring you to General Assembly, but we'll take you to Presbytery. So I really think that's it. The vote swings have either been very broad. So, for instance, there was one presbytery last week that voted 38-0. And then you have the other side where it's like 2 or 3, 4, 5 votes, like in your presbytery. There was 5 votes in each case between the two. So, it just depends on the presbytery and how we get the voters out. So, I've been saying for the longest time, because and I guess I'm right there with more in the PCA.org, that the ruling elder is the one that sort of has his feet on the ground. It's not that teaching elders don't, but they tend to be more engaged on the regular daily basis with things. Ruling elders tend to have to deal with their business and the things on the ground. And so they don't get into the nuance of things. They look at things probably more straightforwardly. So the more they're involved on a regular basis, the better I think it is for the court, because it keeps us, it balances things out, is the way I look at it. It's interesting on the case of the 16-7 here, that of the 7 that voted in favor, in the minority on this case, 5 of them are ruling elders and 2 of them are teaching elders. So, of course, then you have the other side that, would be the same. But that means that of the 16 that voted, since there were 11 teaching elders, that means 9 voted in favor of this. And there were 12. So that means 7 ruling elders voted on the other side. Okay. So it's just an interesting thing to observe that the larger number of teaching elders probably are more nuanced than the ruling elders.
Yeah, in my presbytery, it was ruling elders voted in favor of and I know that because, we have sign-in sheets, and they checked off the votes against the sign-in sheets. Everything was done really well and above board, and everything was right. But it was obvious from that the ruling elders voted about 2-1 for the amendments, and the teaching elders voted about 3-2 against the amendments, proportionally. So it is a fact, and maybe we should ask this question quickly because a lot of people are asking it. Why do ruling elders generally and teaching elders generally have a different view of this? I mean, is it a common sense argument versus a technical argument? Is it kind of a smell test versus give a fellow minister the benefit of the doubt? I mean, what is it, Jared? No, we may have lost Jared.
Oh, well, I don't know the exact answer to that other than you're going to have different experiences, especially in a situation in which you have a trial or a complaint or an investigation against a teaching elder, because every teaching elder is looking at that case and saying that could be my job, and I don't want to judge too hastily on that. So I think that can be a factor if you're talking about a judicial case. If you're talking about just the facts on the ground, I don't know. There's a reason that we have ruling elders and teaching elders, and as much as Respi likes to joke about taking votes away from teaching elders, I think we need each other. But it would be nice if we had a little bit more parity in numbers between each other, because when you have 3/4 of a General Assembly made up of teaching elders, there's a drowning out of the ruling elder voice that really shouldn't be happening.
Dr. Quilla, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I'm not really certain on that, but I do think some people live in the more philosophical realm and others in the real realm. That might be as simple as that. So that sometimes we can be too smart by half if we're not we're not careful, and so I think that's why why it's so good that we do have the parity of elders and our pluralistic system and so forth, that really help us to balance off each other, and so that's a good thing.
All right, so the question on everybody's mind, and it was sort of asked and talked about earlier, is what's next? What would you, Jared and Dr. Quilla, say to let's say you got a church with 90 members and 3 ruling elders and a pastor, and they are scandalized by the idea of Revoice and the fact that we would have something called gay Christian ministers or something like that. And they say this is the last straw, and we're going to consider our options and look for the exits. What would you how would you counsel them? Would you say, okay, see you later, or just ignore this, or what sort of view would you ask them to take?
You're talking about who's the audience that you're speaking to?
To a small church that's kind of very discouraged by this, and they're thinking, well, we're just going to go elsewhere. We're going to take our ball and go to another court. My suggestion is that we always move slowly, carefully. There's no need to rush. I teach church history. When I teach it, I say that if you think about it, the issue of the Trinity was early received in the life of the church. I mean, we have the Apostles' Creed in the early 2nd century, which is Trinitarian. I believe in God the Father. I believe in Jesus the Son. I believe in the Holy Spirit, the God, the Holy Spirit. So, it's already there. However, in terms of definitiveness, it was 325 years before we had the Council of Nicaea. Some things are slow because usually it's something that comes along with that raises a statement. So it took a person like Arius to teach something that was faulty.
and someone like Athanasius said, no, it's this. And so what eventually, what happened is that the church met and decided the matter. And so I think what we need to do is not be afraid to decide a matter. We're confessional people. Let the confession speak. So I would say let's wait and see. However, if there seems to be no real change that's going to happen after a period of time, after you should have done better, then it may be time to consider the possibility of something else. And whether that's where we are right now, I don't know. But I do know that that'll be some of the impulse that will be there. And we don't want to jump the gun too quickly.
Briefly, Dr. Quello, what does church history tell us about the difficulty of forming and sustaining a new denomination or reaffiliating? I mean, it's no fun to reaffiliate either, I gather.
No, it isn't. No, especially if you start from scratch. If you go and something that's already going, then you have to get used to the internal culture and ethos of that denomination, because it's already established, and you're the newbie on the new boy on the block, and you have to get used to their system and their way of doing things. And if you start from scratch, then it's fun for a while and it's exciting to get something off the ground, but then one day you fall into the routine again. And so that's the problem, is that when I teach early American church history, I say that you have Harvard starting in 1636. By 1692, it had gone anti-Trinitarian, and so what happened between 1636 and 1692 that began to happen. And so the tendency of I think someone did calculate it, that the average even faithfulness of an evangelical organization is 70 years. And so, if you get beyond 70, maybe that's a life cycle. The Bible says that, that God gives us 70 years, and if by God's grace it gives us 80, then it's difficult in travail. So maybe that's just something that's endemic in us. Maybe it's in our DNA. The book of Judges shows that. So if we think we're going to find the perfect setting, we're not. But if we believe that something has really gone awry, then we move on. At least for our 70 years, we'll at least be in something that's faithful.
Jared, you've got a lot of friends. You're a social guy. You're a big guy. You're a hugger, like my friend Amish, who's here in the room with us. And so people are going to come up to you at Presbytery or send you emails or texts and say, what should we do? So how are you going to answer those guys?
Well, I'd answer that I think the PCA is definitely worth fighting for a lot of reasons. One is I think we're healthier than the PCUS was in the 1970s. So if you're looking for the escape hatch now, realize there's a lot of patience that our forefathers had before they formed the PCA. And this is an interesting time because I don't know if I was just talking with somebody about this concept of moving in a culture from where the church was a positive thing on your resume to now moving into a place. We've just moved out of the time when it was a neutral thing, and now it's a negative thing. And when that happens, we're moving into a different era where there's a pruning that happens. You have liberals leave. Well, the actual liberals, there have been actual liberals in the PCA, but they tend to leave. For like Fred Hoyle or Harrell that was in San Francisco. And so you have to have some patience. And if you're going to
Fred Harrell at City Church in San Francisco.
Yeah. And what you have to do is kind of that old adage, think global or national, act local. The question is, how involved are you in your session, in your committees at Presbytery, and go into GA and being on committee of commissioners if you're an elder in the church. If you're a person that's a lay person, go talk to your pastor about these things and tell them your concerns and ask them where they are on these things. And you might be surprised at their answer, or you might be comforted by that. And for me, I know I asked this question when the federal vision controversy was going on, and I had to really settle on what does my presbytery look like. I had a discussion with a guy in the PCUSA who thinks of himself as a conservative there. And my question for him was, do you trust your presbytery to appoint somebody that's Orthodox when you leave? And his answer was no. And I said, then get out. I think that's the question is, do you trust your presbytery that your church is safe on who is going to come after you? And if the answer is yes, then it's worth staying around for and having the benefits of being in a connectional church at this time. If the answer is no, I think that's different. So it's hard for me sometimes to say exactly what somebody needs to do in a presbytery that they don't have those assurances.
So patience, everybody loves patience. That's the most fun thing and the easiest virtue to cultivate and exercise is patience and forbearance. So we should be fine then. Everybody will just be real patient. Do you agree, Dr. Aquila, that patience is it's such an easy virtue?
Yeah, it's right. It's not easy, no. Especially if you feel hostile. If you buy the supposition that you know that nobody, some people don't like the slippery slope thing, but when you have statistics that that say that every church in the last 60, 70, 80 years that has adopted a side B side has eventually moved to side A.
Yeah, let's talk about the RCA real quick. The Reformed Church in America. They went from what we would call we won't say traditional sexual ethic because Revoice actually says that they maintain the traditional sexual ethic, but the traditional understanding of identity and concupiscence, desire, sin, sinfulness of certain things, and then the side B, which is more inclusive and more affirming of a certain kind of homosexual identity or persons. But you're saying that any denomination that's gone from the traditional understanding to side B then becomes side A, which is practicing, homosexual relationships, marriage, officers, pastors, and that we don't want to go there. And what we see with the RCA is the side A part going one way and the side B part going the other. Do you believe that if they'd never become side B, there would have never been the side A problem?
There's always a step. You always have to start with side B. Every single church does, thinking they can control it and that they're being sweet and nice and loving and caring. And when in fact the ministry is going out to these people, but the definitions is if you don't do that, then you don't care about people, which is such a fallacy that we're being sold, and that's not true. But it happens, and so the next step is side A. Well, look, everything's fine. We've survived all this here. Why not go the whole distance? So the RCA is an example that 18 months, almost 2 years ago now, about 200, the group started that now is up to at least 200 plus in the Reformed Church in America, RCA, that take the name Alliance of Reformed Churches. They didn't want to form a new denomination yet, but they did it because the side A was around the corner. And now this synod that just had basically did the affirming. And so what the synod did, they had to have a gracious way of withdrawing. And they set up a whole protocol about how to do it, because in the Reformed Church in America, they like in the Presbyterian Church USA, they have the property of a local church is held in trust for the denomination. So they had to make some accommodations in that. So, okay, we allow you to take your property, just consider this and that. So they developed this whole protocol and steps about how you can leave graciously and how the presbytery or the classes is to let you go. Why? Because they knew these folks would leave somewhere or the other, and there would be court battles and some things that will just take, that go on forever and ever. So let's recognize it's going to happen. The separation is going to take place. The fact the alliance was formed indicates that. So And it's interesting that in this way, if you look at the PCA versus the RCA, or the PCA versus the PCUSA, out of which the Evangelical Covenant Order of Presbyterians, the ECO Church, ECO, came, that those churches basically were already committed to an egalitarian view. Women, deacons, elders, and ministers, they were already committed to a missional approach and so forth. But when it came to human sexuality, they drew the line. And so that's what led, when the PCUSA went officially Side A 2010, 2011, by January 2012, the ECO started. When now with this, the Synod of the Reformed Church in America, now going official that way, they already had set up the protocol to make an exit. It always happens. And those churches that go Side A, to use more of a colloquial phrase now, get woke, go broke. And so they get smaller. Their churches get smaller. They get older. They lose money because people vote with their wallets as well as their feet as they go out the back door. And the churches that are left, thinking that they are so missional and they're going to love the world loves them, they don't, and they begin to crumble and they fall apart. And so these churches have trouble now. If you look at the history, I mean, United Church of Christ just the other day, UCC, one of the first to go woke and broke, it had an 8-story or some multi-story building where they kept it full. It was active. It had 500 employees or 300 some number, and now they can't occupy anything but the first floor, so they're putting the building up for sale. And that happens over and over and over again. So if we go this direction, then the history is there. Just read the book, and one, you just cut to the chase and go to Side A and be done with it.
Yeah, and there's an unfortunate divide between sort of city churches and country and suburban churches on some of these issues. But as some of our suburbs are going blue, I think some of your suburban churches are even supporting this. But this will amplify certain divisions that already exist. Well, any closing remarks from you, Jared? Any thoughts?
I would just sum up in saying I don't think that this decision is the end of the road for this. I think we have a pretty good study committee report that, if people would act on in their presbyteries, could have a lot of safeguards involved. I don't think the overture question is answered yet, whether in this cycle or the next. And that if people are concerned, especially elders and teaching elders, they should start going to presbytery, getting involved, even in the mundane work, and getting on committees and serving, seeing how things are done, and being there for if something happens in their presbytery, that people will listen to them. Because if you go to your presbytery meeting and the first time that you show up is to talk about these overtures in a year, people are going to say, "Who's this guy?" You don't have the weight to do that. So I think people need to be involved.
Some people are going to ask if it's too late. Is it too late? That's really going to be the determining how people judge whether it's too late or there's still hope. That's going to determine whether they lose hope and leave earlier, or whether they stick around and fight.
Oh, I definitely don't think it's too late. I think we're in a better position than some people would think, especially in terms of what we came out of.
But it won't be easy, and it wouldn't be easy in a new denomination either. But there are no quick fixes to any great problem. And
one of my heroes is Paul Settle, and if you look at how long that founder of the PCA worked and all the efforts that he put in order to help with the founding of the PCA, there's a lot of effort involved, and leaving can sound easy, but sometimes you need to do the work of a churchman first and make sure all of those avenues are explored. And Paul Settle was long suffering in a lot of ways, and so I think there's a model there. at the end of his wife's life. He was there. She had Alzheimer's and took care of her until her dying day. And I just think of the long-suffering nature of what it takes for like one of the founders of the PCA. If that's our model for how it is that we view our denomination.
All right. Well, thanks for that, Jared. I think we had a similar conversation to this a couple of years ago. You were similarly positive, and I don't remember if I don't know which controversy we were speaking to, or we were probably looking at the run up to the 2019 General Assembly. Don't recall exactly, but when you were on, but you have been on with us before. Dr. Quillany, we want to thank you on both of you for on short notice joining us. But Dr. Quilla, anything you'd like to say, or anywhere you'd like to point people as far as resources or encouragement might be?
Yeah, yes, I do. And I would agree with Jared up to the point, because I'm also one who wants to work within the system and not, because it can be daunting to start up something new, or again, even if you just move to something, another church, or an established denomination. So we need to, work with what we have and trust that we can make a difference. So that this isn't the time. However, I do think that we need to be also honest enough to recognize that the downward trend, that entropy kicks in, and trying to stop it, sometimes it becomes difficult. So even in my eternal optimistic stance, the difference really does come. So, anyway, the bottom line is, I always caution no rushing. Don't get excited. Don't lose hope in sight. And just sort of colloquially, you could always put cream in black coffee. So if you put it in the beginning, you can't take it out. It's already there. So be careful about making those decisions too quickly, because what you move to may be just as bad or worse than what you left. So let's go slowly. Let's pray. Let's ask God for wisdom and guidance about it. But at the same time, make sure that we are laboring and not just waiting and not expecting it to happen automatically. We need to engage and do so in a way that is helpful, and engage brothers that we feel have stepped out of line, and where they're not acting in a way that we think is right. To talk to them and not confront them. I'm saying talk to them, brother to brother. Say, here are my concerns. Maybe they'll listen.
All right. Well, thanks. We'll let both of you go. Thanks for joining us. It's been a
Thanks
pleasure
for having us,
as
Brad.
always. Yes, and when there's much more to be said about this, and this won't be the last time we talk about it. So thanks to both of you for your time and for your input. So as we wrap up, Amish, any thoughts from the cheap seats, as it were?
Yeah, just by Providence. I had this conversation this afternoon with a colleague at work, and she was talking about how her young son is in soccer, and he's playing defense, and he makes a stop. He starts celebrating with his friends, and the other team gets the ball back and kicks it in the goal. I think that PCA conservatives.
Well, this is like spiking the ball before you get to the goal line. We see that every year.
Yeah.
Some genius does that.
But I think PCA conservatives, this is a wake-up call. Greater coordination, greater. What was echo? I want to echo what was said earlier. Just greater involvement in the presbytery level. And there's a lot of hard work to be done. Committees at the GA level and the presbytery level, these are important things to focus on. We can't just, start giving each other high fives at GA, and then, when the real work comes around in presbytery, we don't show up. So hopefully this is a wake-up call.
Yeah, maybe it is. But again, God is sovereign. We do not know the end. He does, and he will. He does love his church, and that's not just a pious platitude. That's the truth, and we believe that. So we, of all people, believe in sovereignty, and optimism is often what's. We can be eternally optimistic. We can be optimistic about eternity, but sometimes it's hard to be near-term optimistic. But the level of concern from church members is not something to be looked down upon, and that also is a good sign if your church cares about these things. It's also good if you care about all sorts of sinners, people that have homosexual attractions and many other things, and don't let anyone tell you that there's one kind of church that loves gay people and sinners, and there's this other group of churches that are mean and hateful and don't care anything about them. As I've said many times, I've never known a church that didn't have people with these issues, but I think there's more than one way to deal with it, and the one that's arisen in the last 10 years, it may or may not be the way. Our skepticism is justified, but we'll trust in the Lord to work this out in His church and in His churches. So we do appreciate everyone joining us. Resby couldn't make it. He's got had kids to take care of tonight, but thanks. We had a very large number of live viewers, and that's appreciated. But stay tuned. We're going to keep covering these issues. And since Resby's not here, I'll just say, don't be an Erdman.
And that shall not kill, thou shall not commit adultery. Thou shalt not bear false witnesses. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife.
Magic on the internet worldwide.